Hi, my name is Jennifer Brown. I'm professor of English and World Literatures at Marymount Manhattan College, where I teach medieval literature. My research interests are devotional and religious literature written by, for, and about medieval women, most specifically in England. Today, I'm going to talk about two book-length texts written by medieval women and the sources that are available for free and online that you can use for teaching and also for your research. So the women are Julian of Norwich and Margery, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about who they are and why they're important, and then show you the sources that you can use. So Julian lived from the mid-14th century to around 1416, and she was an anchoress, which means that she lived an enclosed life in a cell attached to a church. She had essentially given up her civic life to have this religious life of prayer, but it doesn't completely mean she had no social role. And in fact, anchoresses were known to be a place where you could go for advice or for prayer or for intercession. And there is evidence that Julian did indeed serve this function. Julian lived through some of the major events of medieval England, including the Black Death when she was a child and the Peasants' Revolt when she was an adult. When she was about 30 years old, she became extremely ill, near death. And while she was in the middle of this illness, she had a vision from God. Soon after she recovered, she wrote a text describing these visions. And this becomes known as the short text of Julian's Revelations, because later in her life, she writes another text, which is a much more full analysis of the same visions that she had and a fuller interpretation. And this becomes known as the long text. Some scholars don't like this distinction, the short and the long, because it makes the second one sound like a revision of the first, instead of two distinct literary output that she accomplished on her own. Margery knew Julian, at least a little bit, because we know in Margery's book that she went to see Julian and ask her for advice. But Margery's book is quite different than Julian's. Margery lived a little bit later, although obviously their lives overlapped. She was born near the last quarter of the 14th century, and she died around 1440. And Margery lived in Bishop's Lynn, which is now King's Lynn, which is not too far from Norwich. So Margery was from a prominent family. She married John Kemp, and when she was about 20, and with him she had 14 children. And during her life, she also was the recipient of visions from God. And unlike Julian's kind of single moment with her visions, Margery had them consistently, including conversations with Christ and sort of intimate knowledge about God through much of her adult life. And she eventually secures a chaste marriage with her husband, which means that although they remain married, they no longer had a sexual relationship. And she lives a kind of social religious life. She goes on many pilgrimages. She preaches and talks to anybody who will listen to her about her visions. And she dictates her story to at least two people, one who we think is her son, who wasn't terribly good at taking the dictation, and then one who was her confessor, who maybe did a better job. But so there's two parts to her book, and they are a little bit disjointed, but they recount some of the same stories about her life and her visions. Margery also has a very idiosyncratic style and a quirky personality, which students really respond to. She's an interesting read. So the primary sources that I'm going to show you here are first a series that I really find wonderful, the Teams series. Teams is the consortium for teaching the Middle Ages. And the Middle English Text series has really terrific student-friendly editions of many important Middle English texts. The series includes lyrics, sermons, saints' lives, romances, and some full manuscripts that are miscellanies with all the different texts in them. If I'm teaching a whole text, I will order the books for my students because they're not that expensive. They're paperback, they have wonderful notes, they have terrific glossaries, they're easy to use. But if I'm teaching an excerpt or I'm encouraging a student to do independent research, the online versions are terrific and they're free. So here is the book of Margery Kemp, edited by Lynn Staley, and you can see that the text is on top and then the notes are here on the bottom, and you can click on the note and it will come up. This includes some glosses of the Middle English or sometimes manuscript information. Julian of Norwich, edited by Georgia Crampton, operates the same way. Here are the notes and the text. Even though these are in Middle English, they've normalized the spelling a little bit. They don't use thorns. So they're pretty readable and easier for students to use who don't have much experience with Middle English. I also included some links to the manuscript versions of these texts. They're all housed at the British Library. So the short text of Julian and Norwich is a mid-15th century manuscript, and you can see it here, and the library has some nice images of it. And the long text, long text is here. The long text, interestingly, is a 17th century manuscript written by a Benedictine nun in exile, an English nun in exile. The short text is in a Carthusian manuscript. So these are really useful for showing students some basic paleography, the vast difference between a 15th century text and a 17th century text in style and in writing. And also you can talk about the difference between a text written by men for men in a monastic environment and a text written by women for women. The Book of Margery Kemp is also a Carthusian manuscript. It's also available online, and the Margery Kemp project here, which I've also linked, has the manuscript on one side and the transcription on the other, which is really great to even introduce students to very basic paleography, or to show them what a paleographer does and how they might transcribe a text. And finally, for some context, I've included a link to the Medieval Churches of Norwich project, which you can see has a map of medieval Norwich. You can see some of these surviving churches here, and just really get a sense of all of the churches of the area and what medieval Norwich might have looked like. I've also included some links to resources that I found very useful when teaching any text from medieval England. This includes the Middle English Dictionary and Compendium. This interface was traditionally very difficult to use for students, but it's been revamped very recently, and it's much, much more simple. And it shows different forms of the word. I've searched the word showing here for give a sense of Julian and Norwich's. It has the definitions, and then it also has quotations from other texts that use the word, which is, again, very useful for research and for teaching purposes. I've also given a link to the Douay-Rheims Bible. This version of the Latin Vulgate was established in the 16th century, and it's similar to earlier versions that were circulating in Latin in medieval England. So the online version has a search function, which is great. You can search by word, and you can search in the Latin, you can search in the English, or you can have this kind of interspersed Latin and English, which again is extremely useful for both teaching and research. I've included a few secondary sources for further study and reading. And you will find, if you do some research on your own, that there's really quite an extensive amount of literary and cultural criticism on Julian and Margery, attesting to both their kind of unique status as women writers in medieval England, at least named women writers, and how important they are in our literary and cultural study of medieval England. And I hope that you find these useful. So thank you for listening, and happy research and teaching.